Great stories. Well, you know what, Peggy, you started by telling us a little bit about what it takes, you know, about kids not talking down to kids and so forth, and I want to come back to that. But since we're with you now, Tricia, why don't we just jump right into? I asked both ladies, and I thought of it myself too, to think about 5 or 6 sort of real key things about writing for kids, and particularly writing for kids at the age that they write for, that we write for. What would you say were the 5 cornerstones or the keys to being successful in this kind of work? And we were talking about it a little bit before we came in, and we've heard a few of Peggy's, and I want to come back to you, but let's start with you, Tricia, and just jump into what you've learned from Maggie Bean, from all your books since.
The first thing, and it's probably, you have to think about it before you even sit down to write your first pages, to really think about the age of the reader and then the age of the character, because in middle grade and young adult, middle grade 7 to 12, again, young adult, generally 13 and up, sometimes 14 depending on the content, you want to write up for readers. So Maggie Bean is 12, 13, so she's on the high end of the 7 to 12 age, because you want the kids to sort of not necessarily aspire to, depending on the character, to be more like the character, but, you know, for them to just sort of have someone to kind of look up to and to, you know, sort of have as like a guidepost. And then with
Also, kids are less likely to read about kids who are younger than them.
Right.
But
well,
more
yes,
likely to read about
true.
kids who are older than
Yes,
them.
because that's what they're looking forward to, or
Right.
what's going to happen to them when they're a little older. And then with young adults, same sort of thing. Siren and the Siren trilogy is technically 14 and up. Some of my most enthusiastic readers are around the age of 13, but my main character is 17. So I don't get a lot of feedback necessarily from 18 and 19-year-olds, even though very close in age to the character. I get most of the response from like 13 to 15. So just very important to think about that. And then you were talking about age with picture books. That's also very
I mean, with picture books, one of the, I also do freelance editing for children's book authors, and one of the mistakes that I consistently see over and over again in my editing practices is not understanding how essential it is that you write your protagonist as the same age as your intended reader, or just a tiny bit older. But essentially, if you're writing a picture book, you need a kid the same age as the kid that is going to be reading the picture book to be your hero. And a lot of times, beginning writers or aspiring writers in children's lit will make the mistake of writing adult characters as the heroes or the protagonists, or adult characters disguised as bunnies or as pigs or whatever. You can't get away with writing, it's a grown-up even if it's a bunny. You got to make sure that even if you're writing an anthropomorphic character, it's the same emotional age or the same emotional spirit as your intended reader. And that's really, really, really key. What's next on that?
The next item is, it's very important on many levels for many people to make sure that every single part of the story, every single word, sentence, paragraph, scene, chapter, somehow moves the story forward. Again, what I said about the middle grade books, you can write as much as you want, but somebody's going to come back to you. Either they're going to come back to you and say, I stopped at the first page, I don't want to read any more, or they're going to come back to you and say, it's interesting, but the pacing is a big problem because it's very slow. So that the professional side will have that take on it, but if somehow it makes it past the professionals, the agents and the editors, and it reaches a kid, they have so many other things to do. They're very busy and they're very important, and they have lots of other things they could be doing. So you have to hook them, you have to keep them interested, and you have to keep them wanting to turn the page, or they're going to be very quick to put the book down.
And what would you say makes them want to turn the page?
I think you need to start with the action right away. You can't. So it's as you get to know your story. If you don't have, even if you have it mapped out right away, it kind of can take you a while. Take me a while to warm up and sort of get to know what's happening and what direction I'm headed in. So sometimes I can write 2 chapters just sort of leading into the thing that actually starts the story. So then I have to scrap those first 2 chapters that they were just warming me up, and then I start, the 3rd chapter becomes the one that really dives into the action. And then from then on, I mean, you can't go off on dialogue tangents or extra narrative that really, like, or backstory. Really, it's very tempting to really want to explain things and why they think this and what happened that caused that and everything. But it's better to do it in a way that it comes out naturally, either through a conversation, and again, it can't be, 4 paragraphs of, like, it can't be explaining what happened but with quotations around it, because that doesn't work either. It just really has to flow and keep moving and keep
driving the story forward. I can hear you agree.
I'm agreeing with everything you're saying.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, and that's true of middle grade and YA.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And it certainly is true of picture books too. Probably even more so with picture books because you have such a necessary economy of text. With only 1,000 words, you have to start with the action on the first page. You have no time for exposition. You have no time for setup or a backstory or anything else. You literally have to jump in and engage with the first or second sentence. Otherwise, you're lost. And then you can't, with only 1,000 words, you basically want to have no excess fat whatsoever. You don't want to have, adjectives and adverbs basically, unless they're absolutely essential. You basically want to avoid them altogether. Passive voice, indefinite, repetition, anything like that has just got to be pared down to its essence and action, moving the story forward. And another big reason for that with picture books, why action is so important in picture books, is because of the illustrations. You have to think about, you have to be able to think visually when you're writing for picture books, even if you're not an illustrator, which I'm not, and a lot of times, there are author illustrators who, that's a whole kind of process that I can only imagine and dream of, but we work with illustrators, and you have to be able to think visually when you write so that you're giving the illustrator variety of pictures to draw. You don't want to have page after page of talking heads in a picture book. You want the illustrations to be as engaging and fresh from one page to the next as the text, as the story is. And so you want to be sure that on each page there's enough action that's different from the preceding page that it will command an entirely fresh illustration that will continue to engage the reader and compel them to read forward from there.
And there's always more revising to be done. You can revise 8 times and think that that's it. You can't cut another single word, but you can.
Yeah.
When we sold Siren, and I was getting my first round of edit notes from my editor, she always writes these nice emails before she sends the big hefty attachment, and she says, "It's wonderful, it's great, it's gonna be
just
like, yeah, no problem at all. You're just gonna plow right through them. Oh, just one little thing. We need to cut 100 pages." 100 pages, and this had, my agent and I had worked on this book, and I had trimmed this book, so I didn't think it was possible, but it was, and I cut a lot of stuff, and she was right. So they can see things that, and readers, people who aren't you can see things in your work that you probably can't see yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
What's next on this?
Let's see. Well, to your point again, Peggy. Tweens and teens, they're very hip, they're very savvy, much more so than I remember being at their age. So you can't write down to them or preach to them because they will see right through it and toss the book aside. I think it's, on another note, it's very, very important to want to write the story that you're writing because, as y'all know, it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of patience and dedication, and really, you really want to do it because, like teens, there are a lot of other things you could be doing too. But more important than you wanting to write the story that you're writing is that you need to write the story that readers want to read. And an example of this, when I was working on The Melting of Maggie Bean before we sent it out to editors on submission, my agent had another hefty edit letter for me, so I was reviewing everything, and she said that she really thought it was in our best interest for me to rewrite completely the last 50 pages of the book. And Maggie Bean was, in parts, very much based on my childhood experience, but other parts mostly based on it. And the last 50 pages very much, those were things that actually happened to me and my family. And she said that she didn't think it worked with the rest of the story and that readers wouldn't relate to it. And in my head, I said, but these things actually happened to me, so how could they not relate to that? If I could relate to it. But she was right too, and I rewrote the last 50 pages, and it really, once I got going and really thought about what she was saying and reworked the end, I definitely understood what she was saying, and it did make sense, because you were writing for many kids and a very wide audience, hopefully. So very important, and I thought you guys agreed with that too.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I think it's a good point. That's one of my favorite things about writing for kids is that I don't have to write my memoir. You know, like it's so not about me or what my, you know what I mean? It's about the book the kids need. And that for me is a huge relief.
Mm-hmm.
That,
That's right.
it's not my life in there.
Sure, that just took me to your comment about hope. Let's take a moment and talk about that.
Yeah, that was one of my top
What
five.
the kids need.
You have to tell them the truth, but I think you need to leave them with their hope. And I think that's something I certainly struggle with the topics that I deal with and the kids that I write for. I know in No Way Out, which I just read from, as I was telling this story of this really young kid who's in this, very scary, frightening financial situation with his grandmother, who's his caretaker, who's become ill, and they don't have health insurance, and these huge bills are coming in, and there's no other grown-up to take care of him. This is the only person to take care of him, and he knows that if she dies, he goes into the system. He goes into foster care. And for most of these kids, foster care and group homes are the boogeyman. That's the scariest place you can end up. So he goes and works for this drug dealer because that's who's going to pay him. You know, he tries to work at the grocery store, and he's making $60 a week. He goes and works for Lundell. He's making $300. You know. So anyway, so I put him in this awful situation, which becomes just more dangerous and more awful. And then I'm at the end, and I'm like, what am I going to do with this kid? And I know that for the real Harolds, there aren't most of them aren't rescued. And I had this huge conflict with my editor because I said, it's my job to tell them the truth. I have to tell them the truth, and the truth is that, Harold probably dies, or he does go into the system, or something really awful happens, And my editor said, don't do that to them. There's you put it great in your book about
there's a wonderful quote from a Grace Paley novel, and the term that she coined is open destiny.
Open destiny.
And she
Open
says
destiny.
that every character, real or imagined, deserves to have the open destiny of life. In other words,
Right.
we shouldn't write just this train wreck from point A to point Z, straight down all the way. That we need to leave our characters with an open destiny.
Right, and I think that's a beautiful and perfect way to put it. And that's what I ended up doing for him. I gave him the hero.
And I think it's interesting because it's not obviously, there's a fine line between leaving them with their hope and not,
blowing smoke up their ass.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
And, and obviously in adult literature, it's a non-issue.
Right.
You can certainly tell the truth, and it can be as dark as life is, But
Right.
when you're writing for young people, there's a certain amount of responsibility attached to it.
Huge
And,
amount.
one book can actually really make an enormous difference. It can be the thing that either, in that very vulnerable moment when they're about to go into the world, it can be the thing that pushes them in one direction or another.
That's right.
And so there is a kind of a responsibility that comes with it, I think. Would you agree?
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Do you want to share another one of your points? And we'll,
Sure. Well, I totally agree with both of you about, hooking your readers in the first 5 pages, keeping your focus on action and not on exposition, keeping the story moving. You gotta keep it moving. Get in, get out, don't linger, move on. I don't remember who said that. Somebody smarter than me said that. I think you really have to love the kids you write for. I think you really have to love the characters you create. And I think you really have to see the humanity in all of them, especially your villains, because some of the kids you write for might be the villain. And so I think you have to make sure that every person you render is fully human. Fully human. Yeah, and not to get weepy, but I really believe that part of why our series has connected with these young people is because we really love them. We really, really love them. So I get choked up. And I think they know that. And I think they're drawn to that. And that's why they keep coming to us. And so I think that's true for certainly the books I write, and I think for any successful young adult writer and children's book writer, is that you really have to love them. You have to love them. If you don't love them, they'll smell it.
It's true. Although more someday.
Well,
I know that we're up against the hour, so I want to give you guys a chance to ask some questions. I mean, we could sit here and talk about this all night because it's our favorite subject. But let's and maybe we can touch on some more of our points through the questions. But let's just take a moment to throw it out to you guys and see what, if anything, you might be curious to know more about from what we've been talking about.
I'm always curious, do you tend to want to write in first person, or does that matter? Like a picture books, they often tend to be, do you go with the I did this, and the same thing with the young adult books too. Do you find that your readers connect more with the book when
every book is individual that way. So this particular series is in first person. The Dumpy the Dump Truck series is in third person. I think it really is. Each book calls for its own voice, and that's one of the hardest parts. Is first figuring out what that voice is going to be. And in this particular case, it was clear to us it needed to be in first person because the character was so key to the series. It's all about her and her perspective on the world and her take on how she sees herself versus how the world sees herself. So that really called for first person as opposed to third person. And I don't know, how do you make that choice in your books?
I think it really depends on the story and how best you feel you can write the story, because you can hear and read about these, blanket statements made by publishing executives, like they will absolutely not look at anything written in the first person. It's too simple, it doesn't work, and they prefer third person, and so you do hear that a lot. But Merits of Mischief is first person, and I didn't even think about it when I sat down. I just heard his voice, I started writing it as I heard it, and I didn't try to fit into any sort of rule or guideline.
And there's trends too.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll say these things, and then in 6 months it's totally the opposite.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they only want
Right.
first person.
Right.
Or I mean, the latest trend in picture books now is to write in present tense. It's a very that's the hot thing right now. Is you write your character in present tense, and that works sometimes, but it doesn't work for everything. So I think you just have to really be clued into what the voice of the book is asking to be.
I agree.
Anybody else?
Emma, how do you find, because you mentioned you think in visual terms, but you're not an illustrator.
Right.
How do you match yourself to an illustrator?
Okay,
Who
good.
has
I'm so
control
glad
of
you
it?
brought this
How
up,
do you
Stan.
find it and
This was one of my
what's the
points
process?
tonight. Okay, so the short answer to that is you don't. It is not your job as the writer to find an illustrator. If your plan is to write picture books, the worst thing you can do is to find an illustrator and join up with them and pitch your product, your book to a publisher or an agent as a package, the two of you together. Publishers consider it their job, and they take the job very seriously, to match the right art with the right text. And there's an art department in every children's picture book publishing house, and there's an editorial department, and they have a very specific process that they go through, creative process. The good news is, if you're a writer and not an illustrator, obviously it's different if you're an author illustrator. If you happen to be an author illustrator, then that's a whole different kettle of fish. And I would say, make sure if you are an author illustrator that your illustration it leads, because it'll never work if your illustration is substandard. You can actually work with your editor and bring the text up, but if the illustration is not absolutely superb, first rate, it won't get published. It just won't get picked up. So the same is true of if you're just an author, don't make the mistake of pairing up with an illustrator. Especially don't make the mistake of pairing up with your daughter, your best friend, your uncle, your niece, who happens to be a great graphic artist, or that's just death to a picture book. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen books get rejected because a publisher loved the text but hated the art, or loved the art but hated the text, and so the whole thing goes out the window. So what happens is you submit text only in picture books. You submit the text, and you don't even submit it in layout form, in dummy form. You submit it in straight narrative form on 2 or 3 pages, and if it's accepted, then you go into the editorial process of looking for an illustrator with your editor and with the art director at the publishing house. And you look at all the, you can come to the table with ideas, and you can say, well, what we did, for instance, with this book, this artist, Christine Devenier, is French, and she lives in France. And we've never actually met her, although we're Facebook friends. And we've exchanged a lot of nice notes. But she, we came with an idea that we wanted whoever was the illustrator for this series needed to have a sense of humor, and needed to have a freedom of line, a looseness of line, and a kind of a lightness of touch. We didn't want it to be, too painterly or too dark or too serious or too cartoony, or we really wanted it to be very loose. And so then the art director brought us a series of different recommendations of artists, and we zeroed in on the ones that we thought might be the best match, and then we made a wish list, and then you go through and you see, does this artist have time? Are they interested? Do they respond to the material? And you wait for your editor to tell you whether or not they've accepted the assignment.
Kind of following that, once you get your illustrator, does your text change? Does your illustrator come to you depending on the drawing that they need to do, and you have to alter the prose?
Absolutely. You have to. This is another piece that I was going to mention tonight. It's very important when you're writing for picture books, even before you have paired up with an illustrator, to think about the writing in terms of not writing what you think the art will show, because the art wants to tell as much of the story as the text does. In picture books, the art doesn't just mirror the text, it advances the story. It's not just a reflection of what the text is on the page, it's actually telling the story as well. So you'll notice things in here that, you'll notice things that aren't in the text, like this little girl has a cast on her leg. And the varying ages of the children in this dance class, in this dance group. And those are the kinds of things that picture book art will reveal that isn't necessarily in the text. Having said that, often, you go through a working process with an illustrator where you'll see a sketch, a first series of rough sketches, and you'll get to feedback on those, and then you'll see more finished art, and you'll get to feedback on that. But always through the editor. You never get to talk to the artist directly. The editor is always the intermediary, because they want to keep everything very professional, and they don't want things to get cantankerous between, which they sometimes can be. And we're working on a chapter book right now with an artist who it hasn't been an easy process, and there have been moments when we've been really exasperated and frustrated because we keep asking for something and he hasn't done it, and it's now the 3rd or 4th time that we've asked. And it's very good that the editor is there between us, sort of moderating and keeping things balanced for both of us. He's protecting both of us. That said, finally, a piece of art will come in, and we've written that this character's wearing a black jacket and the jacket is clearly navy blue. If it's not important, we'll change the text to suit the art just so we can move forward. And it's a balancing act, There was an artist who did a book of ours called Simeon's Gift, who was a very famous Russian painter, and very, I delivered 12 paintings and he's finished, and there was no feedback allowed whatsoever. But one of the problems that came in was it was fantastically beautiful artwork, but there was a deer that we had written into the story that was supposed to be a doe, and it came in as this sensational stag with, spectacular antlers. And, these are oil paintings, and he's not going to go back and change it. And luckily, the art director said, I think I can Photoshop the antlers out, don't worry. So that's, we saved the day that way. Anybody else, James?
How important do you think it is to have a catchy cover when writing
Very
these
important.
books?
Well, I'd be interested to hear from you guys, but it's really key, and you spend a lot of time working with the art department on what the cover image should be. The idea is, and it's interesting because, well, the covers, this is actually not the dust jacket, but the actual cover, because I didn't want to be fiddling with it. Our covers for the series have just changed. So they're actually reissuing this book and the first book, along with the next books that are coming out in the series, with a border that has sort of sparkles and glitter on it, because they wanted a more unified look across all the jackets so that it could be identified easily as a series. The other thing with picture books is that you want, oftentimes they're displayed facing out, so you want to be able to catch an eye from across the room in a bookstore, you know, where Christian is standing over there and just kind of scanning the bookstore for something. For Isla, you want to be able to see from that distance generally what's on the cover. You want to be able to identify that that's a little girl, and, you know, hopefully to read as much of the title as you can and not have it be too, you know, that's with picture books. That doesn't always happen, but it's, you know, it's important. It's probably very different for you guys in your...
They're also super important, though. I mean, you have a lot of competition in the bookstore, and you want to grab that kid's attention, definitely. It's been interesting as I've come out with different books, just the process of the cover. I myself really don't have any input to start. They come up with the concept. Usually they send me you know, versions of it as they're further along, maybe down to like they've finalized the concept and they're just showing me to make sure like I'm pretty much okay with it, because that's kind of what they've decided.
Well, we should clarify that in the cases of middle grade and YA, these books are not illustrated inside, right? So in picture books, you're obviously the same person who does the illustrations in the book is doing the cover, and there's a unified look throughout. But with YA and middle grade, they're hiring a cover artist, and that is the only piece of art that they're creating for the entire book. So it's different. It's
Yeah.
not surprising that you wouldn't
Be
necessarily
as
be part of
involved,
that
yes.
process, right?
But it's interesting because even if I'm fine with something, and I usually am because I just think it's so exciting that there's a cover, where it can get held up is the sales and marketing team, because they decide that it's not going to fly. The first cover, this is the second cover of the Melting of magazine, actually the first one, which somehow leaked to Amazon so you can still see it if you search for it, was so cute, and it was this blue background, and it had this chubby girl, and she had this little swimsuit on because Maggie tries out for the synchronized swimming team at her school, and she's wearing goggles, and she's got a little hat, you know, the cap on, and she's surrounded by like candy wrappers and stuff. And this was a real girl. They had a photo shoot for it and everything. Still, I thought it was very cute, but so it got past the editorial team. They took it to sales and marketing, and they said because they didn't think enough readers would gravitate toward that cover and want to pick up that book. So they thought the ice cream cone in hand was a much more universal cover, and actually I do like this one much more than I like the first one, but it's just a very interesting process.
And there can be other reasons too. You're right about the sales department.
Mm-hmm.
Sales and marketing is hugely powerful. In fact, that's why we're getting borders, because of the sales and marketing department.
I've read that the power has even like shifted from editorial primarily to
sales and marketing. And that book that I was just describing with the deer with the antlers originally had a white cover. And it was a beautiful white cover with a cameo. It was the illustrations were kind of like an illuminated manuscript, and we got word way into the process that Barnes and Noble would not be taking any orders of the book because they didn't like white covers, because they get fingerprints on them.
And if Barnes and Noble says no, you change your cover.
You do? Because they're such a big customer. Bill.
Peggy, you talked about all of your characters need to be human.
Mm-hmm.
Can you sort of unpack what you mean by human?
I think they all need to be fully formed, real people. I mean, obviously they're characters, so they're not actually real, but fully considered. I think, you know, when you hand a kid a book, in particular my kids, there's a lot of stereotyping that goes on, particularly with my audience. And part of our job is to fight against those stereotypes and really hand them fully realized kids that have a range of emotions, and that, you know, sometimes make bad choices, sometimes make good choices. You know, the toughest kid in school can be really frightened underneath, you know, that kind of stuff. So, does that,
Yeah, that helps.
okay?
So in that vein, does Blueford have any plan, or have you before said, we know who the audience we wrote for, but now we want to take this and we want to pitch it to the complete opposite audience, like in the interest of expansion of tolerance or something like that? Because as a kid, I remember reading things that, I mean, I grew up in the city. If I read something that took place in the Midwest, that was completely foreign. If, you know, I mean, reading even Diary of Anne Frank takes you to a different place. And wouldn't it be, I mean, the characters in these series are, they deal with abandonment and friendship and betrayal and fear and everything that every other
That is common to
kid,
all,
yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
And wouldn't it be, I mean, it just seems like it could be a real tool for opening up this world that, you know, kids that live in this area or in an affluent area, or who are just white, who don't know anything about, or see kids on the cover of a book with black skin. And do they reach for that, and why don't they reach for that? And is it because, I mean, I do work at a school in Shelter Island, and the Scholastic Book Fair is coming up, and those two books you're holding, I've read, and I would like them to be there. And
Well, they will be. They will be.
we Shelter Island?
On Shelter Island,
All right.
represent. That's a great question, and I totally agree with you. We actually, what we do is we, Scholastic leased the rights to our first 10 books. They've just purchased the final 8, so they will now have, we don't hand over the books to them, we let them borrow them for a short period of time. And what they do, it's interesting, they change the covers and they put on, it's kind of funny, but I understand why they do it, like, this is our version of Harold, and this is our version of Lizelle weeping with her giant pregnancy test in her hand. Scholastic will take this cover and they'll use actual models, like kids who look like Will Smith's kids, like really like family friendly, non-threatening black kids, and they repackage them and they sell them at the book fairs, they sell them at Barnes & Noble, the major bookstores. And I understand why they do it. And it reaches a whole different audience, and that's the audience you're talking about. They sell them in Target and, big box stores and that kind of stuff. So they will be at the Shelter Island Book Fair next year.
Where do parents fall into the equation? Do you consider them when you're developing content, or are they not part of the contract? Is it just you and the kid?
Well, we consider them heavily because they're the buyers.
For them,
Yeah.
yes.
They're a big consideration, and also because they're oftentimes they're reading the books with the kids. They're reading them aloud, and you have to remember with a picture book, it's more often than not designed to be read aloud. So, the target audience for this book is not necessarily reading independently all the time, and even if they were, they wouldn't necessarily be reading this much text per page and so forth. So, with a picture book, you're actually writing it with the intention that it be read out loud, and so as a result, when you're writing and in the writing process, one of the things that we do all the time is read it out loud while we're writing it, and make sure and read it out loud again, and read it out loud again, and read it to my kids and read it to any other kids who will listen, and see where we lose them, and see how it plays on the tongue, and where you stumble, and where some words together crash into each other, and stuff like that. That's a big factor. And it's also obviously a big factor from the point of view of sales and marketing, because that's who we're, parents and grandparents. But that is a big part of the marketing, but equally a big part of the marketing is schools and libraries.
Yeah.
And so you're sort of putting all the pieces together in this pie. You have
Yeah, not so much with young adult, because those kids generally, a lot of the times, can buy the books themselves. They get gift cards and go and do things. But middle grade definitely, because not just the parents who are screening, hopefully, the books, but also the schools and librarians, because that's the other part of the book buying. outside. So they're hugely important. You don't want to offend anyone, and they're the gatekeepers, and you don't want them to think your book is inappropriate, and they just won't buy it, and it won't reach those kids.
It's terribly, terribly important. And there is a school and library department in every publishing house whose sole job is to, sell these books to the schools and libraries and to manage, enrichment materials that might accompany those, teachers' guides and so forth, and book fairs and author visits and those kinds of things.
So, and I just want to be considerate of the people who may have to go on, because we could go on
I
forever.
know.
This is absolutely, it's so interesting and so wonderful of you guys, and I really want to thank you for coming. And we do have a few books at the table, and maybe we could have a slow line where you can ask more questions as you go through, because this was wonderful, and I feel like we just kind of hit the
Scratch the surface.
Yeah, and it
It's
was
true,
just
it's
great.
true.
Thank you guys so much.